A gavel slams down, shattering the illusion of a happy family. This is the true story of the Gilded Age, an era of unimaginable wealth forged through ruthless betrayal within the very homes of America's industrial titans. By the end of this journey, you will understand how the relentless pursuit of fortune systematically destroyed the closest family bonds. We will uncover the secret deals that turned brother against brother and the shocking wills that disinherited loyal sons. Did any of these powerful dynasties manage to escape the corrosive touch of their own greed? Or was every fortune ultimately stained by familial blood? What do you believe is the true cost of a legacy built on betrayal? The sound of that gavel was merely an echo of a far older betrayal. Long before the courtrooms, the first cracks in the family foundation were laid by the man who started it all, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Known as the Commodore, he did not build his shipping and railroad empire with polite handshakes. He built it by steamrolling over anyone in his path, and that path was often littered with the ambitions of those he called family. His own son, Jacob, learned this brutal lesson firsthand. Jacob was not just an heir, he was a trusted lieutenant, managing a critical part of his father's steamboat business. He believed he was being groomed for leadership, that his loyalty would be rewarded with a lasting partnership. But for the Commodore, loyalty was a currency to be spent, not a bond to be honored. When a business dispute arose, the Commodore saw a simple solution. He forced his own son to choose between his father and his principles. Jacob refused to betray his own business partners, a stand that required a shred of integrity. In response, the Commodore did not just fire his son. He completely and publicly cut Jacob off, exiling him from the business and drastically reducing his inheritance. This was more than a business decision, it was a declaration. It taught everyone watching, especially the rest of the Vanderbilt clan, that in this new world of industrial fortune, no relationship was sacred. The family name was secondary to the family fortune. The precedent was set in stone, or perhaps in steel rail. The pursuit of ultimate control would always come first, even if it meant destroying your own blood. The Commodore's lesson in ruthlessness was not lost on his chosen heir, William Henry. Yet, the inheritance William finally secured was a poisoned chalice, tainted by his father's last and most shocking act of manipulation. On his deathbed, the frail Commodore was surrounded by a cabal of spiritualists and his second wife, who skillfully preyed upon his fears. They convinced the old Titan that William, the son who had diligently rescued the railroad empire from collapse, was secretly plotting against him. In a moment of profound weakness, the Commodore rewrote his will, slashing William's share to a pittance and leaving the bulk of his colossal fortune to his favorite son, the ne'er-do-well Cornelius Jeremiah. The betrayal was absolute. It was only through a desperate, last-minute legal scramble that William managed to prove his father was not of sound mind, overturning the will and claiming his birthright. This near disinheritance did not teach William the value of family unity. Instead, it taught him to fear his own children. When it came time for him to write his own will, he designed it as a weapon of control from beyond the grave. He consolidated his unimaginable wealth, one of the largest fortunes in American history, into a single, massive trust. His 8 children would receive the income, but not the principal. This ensured they remained dependent, forever bound to the fortune but powerless to break it apart. The deepest cut was reserved for his eldest son and namesake, Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Cornelius had been the reliable, steady hand, the one who managed the New York Central Railroad and embodied the family's public dignity. But William, haunted by his own father's betrayal, saw ambition as a threat. He bypassed Cornelius for control of the trust, giving overwhelming power to his two youngest sons. This was not a reward for their competence. It was a deliberate check on Cornelius's authority, a final declaration that no single child could be fully trusted. The result was exactly what William should have feared most. Upon his death, the fragile peace shattered. The siblings turned on each other in a series of vicious court battles, fighting over the spoils of their father's distrust. Cornelius II, publicly humiliated and financially sidelined, found himself legally pitted against his own brothers. The War of the Wills was not just about money. It was the final, bitter harvest of a family tradition where betrayal was the only true inheritance. And the most tragic part, this pattern of self-destruction was not unique to the Vanderbilts. Another titan of industry was watching, and he believed he could build a dynasty strong enough to avoid their fate. While the Vanderbilts waged war in courtrooms, another dynasty was tearing itself apart in the ballrooms and on the very streets of New York. The Astor family did not just have wealth, they owned the city itself. As Manhattan's greatest landlords, their name was synonymous with power and high society. But behind the marble facades of their mansions, a deep chill was settling between two brothers, William Backhouse Astor Sr. and John Jacob Astor III. Their father had divided his empire, hoping to create a balance of power. Instead, he created a Cold War. William, the older brother, inherited the heart of the fortune, the sprawling real estate that generated unimaginable rental income. John Jacob, known as the Colonel, received a smaller share, but leveraged it to become just as formidably rich. The family business was no longer a unified empire, but two rival courts. The battle was not fought with legal documents alone. It was fought for the ultimate prize in their world, social supremacy. The weapon of choice was the guest list. The Colonel's wife, the formidable Charlotte Augusta Gibbs, believed her husband's line was the true heir to the Astor name and glory. She set her sights on dethroning William's wife, the quiet and reserved Margaret Armstrong, as the Queen of New York society. This was a betrayal not of business, but of blood, a deliberate campaign to humiliate a brother's family in the most public way possible. Charlotte Augusta, who would become infamous as simply Mrs. Astor, declared that there were only 400 people in New York who truly mattered. She alone would decide who was in and who was out. With her ally, the social architect Ward McAllister, she created a list, the famous 400, and her own name was at its pinnacle. William's branch of the family was systematically sidelined, their invitations to the most exclusive events growing fewer and farther between. The brothers, who should have been partners, became bitter competitors in everything from their charitable donations to the size of their yachts. The rift was so profound it lasted for generations. A permanent fracture in the family line, all for the sake of a party invitation and a newspaper headline. The Astors proved that the most cutting betrayals could be delivered not with a gavel, but with a perfectly addressed envelope. This social war had a single, undisputed general, Mrs. Astor. For decades, she was not just a name in the society pages. She was the final arbiter of who belonged in the glittering world of the elite. Her weapon was the guest list, and she wielded it with a ruthlessness that would have impressed any railroad baron. To secure her throne, she did not hesitate to betray her own relatives, cousins and in-laws who dared to challenge her authority, or who simply failed to meet her exacting standards, found themselves permanently exiled from her famous 400. One of her most telling exclusions was her own sister-in-law, Elizabeth Schermerhorn Jones. Elizabeth was wealthy, well-connected, and a direct relation, yet she was deemed insufficiently fashionable, a social sin for which there was no pardon. By cutting Elizabeth out, Mrs. Astor sent a chillingly clear message to the entire family. No one, not even those bound by blood or marriage, was safe from her social guillotine. Her betrayals were not acts of petty spite, but calculated maneuvers to eliminate any potential rivals to her power. She understood that in the world of high society, influence was a finite resource, and she would hoard it all for herself. She even turned on her own nephew, William Waldorf Astor, when he returned from England with ambitions of his own. Viewing him as a direct threat, she used her vast network to undermine him at every turn, ensuring his efforts to claim social leadership were met with cold shoulders and closed doors. The very family connections that should have been a source of strength and alliance were systematically severed to feed one woman's insatiable need for control. But what happens when the queen finally falls, and the empire she built on betrayal is left without an heir? The poison of distrust did not stop at the mansions of the Vanderbilts and Astors. It seeped into the very heart of Wall Street itself, where a different kind of baron reigned. Jay Gould was the ultimate predator of the Gilded Age, a man so feared and despised that his name became a byword for financial treachery. His most infamous act of betrayal was not reserved for a competitor, but for his own partner in crime, the flamboyant James Fisk. Together, they had waged the Erie Railroad Wars, a brutal financial conflict that involved printing fraudulent stock and even fleeing to New Jersey with the company's treasury to avoid arrest. They were allies, partners in plunder, until the moment it was no longer advantageous. During the gold market panic of 1869, a scheme they had orchestrated together spiraled out of control. When the government was forced to intervene and the market collapsed, Gould secretly sold his own holdings, knowing his actions would ruin Fisk and countless others. He escaped with a fortune, while Fisk was left to face the public's fury. This was the foundational lesson Gould taught, that no partnership, no matter how lucrative, was more important than personal survival and profit. This culture of treachery became the only inheritance he truly left his children. When Jay Gould died, he did not create a single controlling trust like William Vanderbilt. Instead, he split his massive railroad and telegraph empire directly among his 6 children, pitting them against each other from the very start. The stage was set for a war of succession that mirrored their father's own ruthless business tactics. The eldest son, George, was named as the primary executor and was expected to steward the family fortune, but he lacked his father's cunning and iron will. He embarked on ambitious projects to build a transcontinental railroad system, a vision that required unity. Instead, he found sabotage from within his own family. His siblings, particularly his brother Howard and his sisters, watched as George's ventures began to falter. Rather than offering support, they saw an opportunity. They turned on him, accusing him of mismanaging their shared inheritance and depleting their individual wealth. The family solidarity that George desperately needed was the one thing his father's legacy had made impossible. The final humiliating blow came in the form of a lawsuit. Howard Good, embodying his father's spirit of ruthless self-interest, took his own brother to court. He sued George to reclaim what he claimed was his rightful share of the estate, arguing that George's failed investments had cost them all dearly. It was a public spectacle, a brutal legal battle that laid bare the deep animosity festering between the Good heirs. The case dragged on for years, draining family resources and creating a permanent schism. George Good died a broken man, his health and fortune shattered, having been destroyed not by business rivals, but by his own blood. The Good family fortune, built on the public betrayal of James Fisk, was ultimately dismantled by the private betrayals of the next generation. Each of these powerful families believed their wealth would secure their legacy for 1,000 years, but they failed to understand the corrosive ingredient they had baked into its very foundation. What happens when that same poison reaches across an ocean and infects the very soul of a nation? The courtroom became the final battlefield for the Good dynasty, a place where the brothers who inherited a fortune built on betrayal turned their father's own tactics against each other. George J. Good, the eldest, was left to manage a sprawling and unstable empire of railroads. He tried to expand it into a true transcontinental network, a vision that required immense capital and, more importantly, unity. But his siblings saw his ambition not as a path to greater wealth for all, but as a direct threat to their individual shares. The trust their father had created was not an instrument of control, but a ticking time bomb of resentment. Howard Good watched his brother's ventures with a cold and calculating eye. When George's overextended system began to falter under the weight of debt and economic pressure, Howard did not offer a lifeline. He saw an opportunity. He filed a sensational lawsuit against his own brother, accusing George of gross mismanagement and of squandering the family's inheritance on his failed dreams. This was not a quiet family dispute. It was a public spectacle that dragged on for years, with lawyers and private investigators digging for every piece of dirt they could find. The legal fees alone were staggering, draining the very fortune they were fighting over. Howard's wife, the actress Viola Catherine Clemens, even joined the fray, filing her own separate suit to protect her personal interests from what she claimed was George's financial recklessness. It was a complete and total family implosion. George, once the steward of a potential empire, was financially and physically broken by the relentless legal assault from his own blood. He died with his health shattered and his reputation in tatters, a fate orchestrated not by a business rival, but by his younger brother. The Good fortune, already stained by the public betrayal of James Fisk, was systematically dismantled in a series of private, familial backstabbings. The pattern was now undeniable. From the Vanderbilts to the Astors to the Goods, the relentless pursuit of wealth had systematically corrupted the very idea of family, turning heirs into adversaries and inheritance into a curse. But what about the women born into these gilded cages? Were they merely passive pawns in this high-stakes game, or did they find their own ruthless ways to fight back? The same poison of control flowed through the veins of the Rockefeller dynasty, but its patriarch prescribed a different cure. John D. Rockefeller Sr., the man who built Standard Oil into an industrial colossus, ruled his family with the same iron discipline he applied to his business. His home was not a sanctuary from the cutthroat world of commerce. It was an extension of it. He demanded absolute obedience, meticulous accounting of every cent, and unwavering adherence to his Baptist morals. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was raised not as a beloved child, but as the sole heir to a financial empire and a crushing set of expectations. From his earliest days, Jr. was given a ledger book. He was required to account for every penny of his allowance, noting expenses for candy, charity, and even a new pair of shoes. This was not a lesson in frugality. It was a system of psychological control, a constant reminder that his entire existence was an entry on his father's balance sheet. The pressure was immense, a suffocating weight that forged a deeply anxious and conflicted young man. He was trapped in a gilded cage, groomed for a role he felt utterly unprepared to fill. The betrayal here was subtle, yet profound. It was the betrayal of a childhood, sacrificed at the altar of paternal control and corporate legacy. For years, Junior struggled desperately to meet his father's impossible standard, working tirelessly within the Standard Oil Trust. But he was perpetually overshadowed by the titan his father had become, his own identity swallowed by the immense Rockefeller name. The breaking point came not from a sudden revolt, but from a slow, simmering realization. He could not be his father, and the empire his father built was increasingly under attack from muckraking journalists and government trustbusters. The very name Rockefeller was becoming a symbol of corporate villainy. In a move that shocked his father's inner circle, Junior began to step away from the direct management of the business. He would not betray his father by challenging him openly, but he would betray his father's life's work by rejecting its core principle. He turned his back on the relentless acquisition of wealth and devoted himself to its systematic distribution. Philanthropy became his rebellion. He took the fortune born from his father's cutthroat business tactics and poured it into institutions that aimed to heal and uplift, funding universities, medical research, and conservation projects on a scale the world had never seen. It was a quiet, profound act of defiance, a son using his father's own fortune to forge a completely different legacy. He transformed the Rockefeller name from a byword for monopoly into a symbol of benevolent power. But this act of redemption through betrayal left a haunting question. Could any amount of philanthropy ever truly wash away the original sin of a fortune built on such ruthless control? Yet even this grand act of philanthropic redemption could not fully cleanse the family bloodline of its inherent tension. The conflict simply evolved, moving from a father's control over a son to a brutal war of ideologies among brothers. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had 5 sons, and he tried to instill in them a sense of shared responsibility for the family's vast fortune and its charitable mission. He created the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, envisioning it as a unified vehicle for their collective goodwill. But the brothers were not a harmonious team. They were a boardroom of rivals, each with a radically different vision for power. On one side stood Nelson Rockefeller, the charismatic and ambitious second son. He did not just want to give money away, he wanted to wield the Rockefeller name as a political weapon, dreaming of the ultimate prize, the White House. His vision for the family foundation was as an extension of his own political machine, a tool to build alliances and fund the causes that would propel him to national office. This put him on a direct collision course with his older brother, John D. III. John was his father's son in temperament, a quiet, meticulous man dedicated to traditional, apolitical philanthropy, focusing on art, culture, and population control. He saw Nelson's political ambitions as a dangerous perversion of their duty, a betrayal of the family's hard-won reputation for benevolent neutrality. The foundation's boardroom became their battlefield. Nelson, leveraging his formidable charm and political connections, repeatedly outmaneuvered his older brother. He formed secret alliances with his younger brothers, particularly Lawrence and David, convincing them that his path to political power would elevate the entire Rockefeller legacy, while John's cautious approach was a path to irrelevance. In a stunning series of boardroom coups, Nelson systematically stripped John III of his influence over the family's charitable endeavors. The elder brother, who had dedicated his life to upholding his father's philanthropic vision, found himself sidelined and humiliated within his own family's institution. This was not a betrayal for money, but for a far more potent currency: control over the family's soul and its future direction. The brother who believed he was protecting the legacy was cast aside by the brother who was determined to reinvent it. The question hanging over every gilded fortune was no longer just who would inherit the wealth, but who would get to write its final chapter. Even the Rockefellers' ideological war seemed almost civil compared to the deep emotional scars carved into the Carnegie fortune. Andrew Carnegie's story is the ultimate American parable, a poor Scottish immigrant boy who clawed his way to become the richest man in the world. He preached a gospel of radical philanthropy, declaring that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. Yet for all his lofty ideals about giving wealth away to humanity, he struggled profoundly with sharing it with the very people who shared his blood. His own family's journey from rags to riches was paved with his early, ruthless betrayals. As a young telegraph operator, he caught the eye of Thomas Scott, a powerful Pennsylvania Railroad executive. Scott became more than a boss. He was a father figure, taking the ambitious teenager under his wing and teaching him the secrets of the railroad and high finance. When the Civil War created an opportunity to invest in a company making railroad sleeping cars, Scott secured a loan for his young protege, allowing Carnegie to buy his first major stake. This was the mentorship of a lifetime, a hand up that launched an empire. But when Scott later faced financial ruin during a railroad panic, he turned to the man he had made, asking for a loan to save his fortune. Carnegie, sitting on a mountain of cash, refused. He coldly turned his back on his mentor, leaving Scott to die in disgrace and poverty. It was a calculated act of self-preservation that revealed a core truth. For Andrew Carnegie, sentimentality was a luxury he could not afford, not even for the man who gave him his start. This same chilling pragmatism defined his dealings with his own relatives. He brought his brother Tom into the business, making him a partner in Carnegie Steel, but it was never an equal partnership. Andrew held the overwhelming majority of control, and he micromanaged every decision, treating his brother more as a subordinate than a partner. The constant strain and the weight of living in his older brother's shadow are believed to have contributed to Tom's early death. For his cousin, George Lauder, who was like a brother to him growing up, Carnegie provided a comfortable job but kept him on a strict salary, never granting him a significant ownership stake in the colossal enterprise he helped build. He surrounded himself with family, yet he built financial walls between them, ensuring that while they were cared for, they would never be true equals or threats to his sole authority. He was generous with gifts and allowances, but he was miserly with real power and ownership. How could a man so determined to give away his entire fortune to the world find it so difficult to generously empower his own family? The answer may lie in the very trauma of his childhood poverty, a deep-seated fear that trust could lead to ruin, and that the only person who could truly safeguard the Carnegie legacy was Andrew Carnegie himself. Andrew Carnegie's death left his wife, Louise, with an immense burden and a singular mission. She was now the sole guardian of his sprawling philanthropic empire, a $130 million trust dedicated to libraries, world peace, and scientific research. This was not merely an inheritance, it was a sacred charge. But in elevating his wife as the primary executor of his vision, Carnegie inadvertently created a deep and lasting schism within his own family. Relatives who had stood by him for decades, the cousins and in-laws who had worked loyally within his steel company for modest salaries, watched as Louise assumed total control over the fortune. They had expected that their long service and shared blood would finally be rewarded with a meaningful share of the wealth, or at least a voice in its legacy. Instead, they found themselves completely shut out. The man who had written so eloquently about the duties of the rich had, in their eyes, failed his most basic duty to his own kin. They felt betrayed, reduced to mere spectators as Louise, guided by a board of trustees, directed the colossal flow of Carnegie's wealth toward the grand, impersonal causes he had championed. The very trust designed to uplift humanity became a monument to their own exclusion. Louise, fiercely protective of her husband's wishes, saw their claims as a threat to the purity of his philanthropic mission. She believed any diversion of funds to family would tarnish Carnegie's hard-won reputation and betray the gospel of wealth he had preached. So she held the line, enforcing his will with a resolve that deepened the estrangement. The cousins who had once gathered for holidays now drifted away, their connections severed not by a lack of money, but by the profound feeling that their loyalty and shared history meant nothing. The fortune that was meant to buy Carnegie a place in history had cost him his family's unity. His legacy of giving was forever shadowed by this quieter, more personal legacy of neglect. And so we are left to wonder, can a name celebrated in stone and steel, etched on the facades of thousands of public libraries, ever be truly cleansed if the foundation of that legacy is cracked by the betrayal of those held closest? The very public feud between Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick reveals that betrayal did not require a bloodline to cut just as deep. This was a partnership forged in steel and ambition, a bond so close it functioned as a family, with Carnegie as the absent patriarch and Frick as the ruthless enforcer. For years, their alliance was perfect. Carnegie provided the capital and the grand vision, while Frick managed the brutal, day-to-day operations of their mills, doing the dirty work so Carnegie could maintain his public image as a benevolent philosopher of wealth. That delicate arrangement shattered during the Homestead Strike of 1892, when the workers at the Homestead plant revolted against a proposed wage cut. Carnegie, as he often did, retreated to his castle in Scotland. He left Frick in charge with one unspoken command: break the union, no matter the cost. Frick did exactly that. He erected a 3-mile-long fence topped with barbed wire around the mill, turning it into a fortress. He hired 300 agents from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, effectively a private army, and sent them up the river on barges to retake the plant by force. The resulting battle was a massacre. Dozens of men were killed or wounded, staining the riverbank with blood. The public outrage was immediate and fierce, and it was directed squarely at Henry Clay Frick. And then, from across the Atlantic, came the ultimate betrayal. Andrew Carnegie, seeking to salvage his own reputation, publicly denounced Frick's brutal tactics. He claimed he never authorized such violence, throwing his partner and friend directly under the wheels of the press. For Frick, this was an unforgivable act of cowardice and hypocrisy. He had done precisely what Carnegie wanted him to do, and now he was being sacrificed as the villain to protect Carnegie's saintly image. The enmity became lifelong and deeply personal. When Frick later negotiated the monumental sale of Carnegie Steel to J. P. Morgan, creating U.S. Steel, he made sure to secure his own fortune before handing Carnegie the final documents. The legend says that when a stroke later confined Frick to a wheelchair, he was asked if he would finally forgive Carnegie. Frick's reply was icy: "I will meet him in hell, where we both are going." This was more than a business dispute. It was a family-level feud that fractured their entire social world, forcing mutual friends and business associates to choose sides. The two titans, who had built an empire together, spent their remaining years in the same elite circles, moving in a cold, silent orbit of mutual hatred. Even the most legendary financier of the Gilded Age was not his own man. J. Pierpont Morgan was born into a cage of dynastic expectation, its bars forged by his formidable father, Junius Spencer Morgan. From the very beginning, Pierpont's life was not his own to shape. It was a vessel for the Morgan name and the transatlantic banking empire Junius was building. The betrayal here was not a dramatic courtroom battle or a disinheritance, but a slow, lifelong suffocation of the son's own spirit and instincts under the weight of paternal control. Junius was a distant, demanding patriarch who micromanaged his son's career from across the ocean, dictating everything from major business partnerships to the most minute details of his personal conduct. He forced the naturally passionate and impulsive Pierpont into a mold of cold, reserved propriety, believing that only rigid self-control could ensure the family's financial supremacy. This constant oversight was a silent message, a fundamental lack of trust in the very son being groomed to inherit everything. The conflict between them simmered for decades, erupting over business decisions where Pierpont's bold intuition clashed with his father's methodical caution. Junius repeatedly vetoed his son's ambitious ventures, seeing them as reckless gambles that threatened the careful reputation he had spent a lifetime constructing. The most profound betrayal, however, was far more personal. Pierpont suffered from a childhood skin condition, rosacea, which left his nose famously enlarged and discolored. In an era obsessed with appearances, Junius saw his son's face as a public relations disaster, a mark of imperfection that could undermine the Morgan image of unshakable strength and control. He relentlessly pressured Pierpont to have it surgically corrected, a painful and dangerous procedure in the 19th century. This was not an act of concern for his son's well-being, but a calculated effort to sanitize the family's public persona, to erase a flaw he found embarrassing. The man who would later command Wall Street with a single glance was made to feel deeply self-conscious about his own appearance by the one person whose approval he desperately sought. He eventually underwent the surgery, but the emotional scar remained. J.P. Morgan spent his entire life building a myth of unassailable power, yet he could never fully escape the ghost of his father's disapproval, a constant reminder that in the House of Morgan, the individual always came second to the dynasty. The son inherited more than a fortune. He inherited a fortress under siege. J. Pierpont Morgan Jr., known as Jack, was never meant to be the sole heir. His father's empire was supposed to pass to two sons, but his older brother died young, leaving Jack alone to shoulder a legacy he never asked for and never truly wanted. He was a quiet, private man, thrust into the most public role in global finance. The pressure was immense, a constant, crushing weight of expectation from his father and the entire financial world. He confessed in his private letters that he felt trapped, a prisoner in a gilded cage of his own name. This sense of betrayal was not about money, but about the theft of a peaceful life. His father had built an institution so powerful, it was essentially a central bank for the United States. And now Jack was expected to be its unwavering pillar. The public scrutiny his father had commanded with intimidating silence now fell upon Jack as a torrent of hostility. The Pujo Committee hearings of 1912 and 13 were not just a political investigation. They were a public shaming. For days, Jack was forced to sit before a congressional panel and answer for his father's actions, for the very structure of American capitalism. He was grilled about the so-called money trust, the secret alliances between banks that critics claimed held the nation's economy hostage. The Morgan name, once synonymous with unshakable power, was now being painted as a symbol of sinister control. He felt deeply betrayed by his own country, watching as politicians and the press dismantled the reputation his family had spent 2 generations building. This public ordeal only deepened his instinct to retreat, to protect the Morgan Bank by pulling it further from the public eye. But the betrayals did not end in the hearing room. They followed him home into the very heart of the family business. Jack clashed bitterly with his own partners and relatives over the future of the House of Morgan. He saw his father's most trusted lieutenant, George Perkins, as dangerously ambitious, a man whose grand visions for the bank's expansion threatened to destabilize the cautious, relationship-driven institution Jack was trying to preserve. He eventually forced Perkins out, a painful but necessary act of severance. Even his own son, Harry, became a source of conflict. Harry did not want the life of a banker. He dreamed of a career in politics. For Jack, this felt like a profound rejection of his life's work, a betrayal of the dynastic duty that had defined his own existence. He had sacrificed his personal happiness for the Morgan name, and now his own heir was choosing to walk away. Jack Morgan spent his entire life defending a fortress he never built, fending off attacks from the outside while managing insurrections from within. He was the guardian of a legacy that ultimately left him isolated, proving that the greatest burden of a gilded inheritance is not the management of wealth, but the terrible loneliness of command. The lonely command of a financial fortress was one kind of prison, but the Duke family proved that a tobacco monopoly could build a cage just as confining. Washington Duke began with nothing, a dirt-poor farmer from North Carolina who returned from the Civil War with a bag of tobacco and a simple wooden press. He built his first company with his sons, Brody and James Buchanan, known to everyone as Buck. It was a true family enterprise, a partnership forged in the dusty fields of the rural South. But that unity was the first thing to be sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Brody Duke was the older brother, the one who had worked alongside his father from the very beginning. He was content with the steady, respectable business they had built. Buck, however, saw a far grander future, a vision of total domination that his brother found reckless and dishonorable. The conflict over business strategy was a betrayal of their shared past. Buck wanted to embrace the new, automated cigarette rolling machines and wage a price war to crush every competitor. Brody believed this newfangled industrial approach was a betrayal of their core values, a ruthless path that would destroy the very community that had supported them. When Buck pushed the family firm into a brutal series of mergers and acquisitions, Brody could no longer stand it. He sold his shares and walked away from the company his own father had founded, a profound schism that left the two brothers estranged for the rest of their lives. The family business was no longer a family affair. It was now the personal engine of Buck Duke's insatiable will. He steamrolled over every other regional tobacco family, forcing them into his American Tobacco Company trust or driving them into bankruptcy. And he did not hesitate to turn that same ruthless pressure on his own relatives. When cousins and in-laws who owned small, competing firms refused to sell out to him, Buck did not negotiate. He declared war. He used his immense financial power to undercut their prices, steal their customers, and squeeze them out of business entirely. He betrayed the very notion of kinship, treating his own blood as mere obstacles to his monopoly. The ultimate punishment for this defiance was disinheritance. Washington Duke, the patriarch, had always intended for his wealth to benefit his extended family. But Buck, who now controlled the fortune, had a different philosophy. He rewrote the family's financial future, systematically cutting off every relative who had dared to oppose his business practices. Their loyalty to the old ways, or simply their desire to run their own companies, was seen as a personal insult. They were cast out of the will, their names erased from the legacy that Washington Duke had meant to be a source of shared prosperity. The fortune that had begun as a bag of tobacco pressed by a father and his sons became a monument to one man's victory over his own kin. And in a final, ironic twist, Buck Duke himself would die without a son to carry on his name, leaving a vast fortune to a university, ensuring that the Duke legacy would be remembered not for its family, but for the institution that inherited its wealth. Buck Duke's victory over his own family created a kingdom without a crown prince, leaving a daughter as his only heir. Doris Duke was just 12 years old when her father died, instantly becoming the richest girl in the world. But this unimaginable inheritance was not a gift of freedom. It was a prison designed by her father from beyond the grave. He did not trust a young woman, or perhaps anyone, with the fortune he had wrested from his own brother. So he locked the entire estate away in a rigid trust, controlled not by his daughter, but by a board of stern, male trustees from the tobacco company and the family's legal firm. These men were not mentors. They were jailers appointed to manage every aspect of Doris' life until she turned 30. She could spend the astronomical income, but only with their explicit approval for every major decision. The betrayal was not in the denial of wealth, but in the denial of agency. The heiress to one of America's greatest fortunes had less control over her own life than a shopkeeper's daughter. This deep-seated resentment would define her entire life, sparking a decades-long war against the very advisors her father had entrusted. She saw their every move not as prudent management, but as a personal challenge to her autonomy. When she fell in love and wanted to marry, the trustees launched a humiliating investigation into her fiancé's background. When she wanted to purchase a simple home, she was forced to plead her case before a committee of old men. The pattern was relentless, a constant reminder that in the eyes of the trust, she was not Doris Duke, a person, but simply the asset known as the Duke fortune. Her rebellion was as vast as her wealth. She became a globe-trotting enigma, collecting art, homes, and husbands, spending lavishly in a lifelong campaign to assert her own will against the ghost of her father's control. But the final, most bitter legal battles came at the very end of her life. Elderly and in declining health, Doris found herself surrounded by a new generation of advisors, including her butler, Bernard Lafferty. Distant relatives who had been kept at a financial distance for decades watched this relationship with alarm and saw an opportunity. They swooped in, petitioning the courts to have Doris declared incompetent, arguing that Lafferty was manipulating her for control of the estate. The courtroom became the stage for the Duke family's final betrayal. Cousins and lawyers who had played no part in her life now fought to have her declared a prisoner in her own mind, all to seize control of the money that had poisoned their family for generations. Doris Duke won that battle, but she could never win the war. She died as she had lived, the richest woman in the world, yet perpetually fighting for the one thing her father's fortune could never buy: the simple right to call her own life her own. A gold mine did not just buy George Hearst his fortune, it bought his son a megaphone. William Randolph Hearst inherited not just wealth from his father, but a profound understanding of how to wield influence. He transformed his father's mining and real estate empire into a media dynasty, building a coast-to-coast network of newspapers that did not just report the news. They manufactured it. This power to shape public opinion came with a brutal condition: absolute loyalty from everyone, including his own family. Anyone who dared to question his methods or his sensationalist yellow journalism was treated not as a dissenting relative, but as a traitor to the Hearst brand. He systematically ostracized cousins and in-laws who voiced discomfort with his tactics, cutting them out of both business decisions and family life. The message was clear: you were either with William Randolph Hearst, or you were against him. and being against him meant you were no longer family. The deepest cut of all, however, came from his own son. William Randolph Hearst Jr. was groomed from birth to be the heir to this media kingdom. He was given control of the New York Journal-American and was expected to be a loyal lieutenant, echoing his father's bombastic style and fiercely isolationist politics. But the son had lived through the consequences of his father's power. He saw how the relentless pursuit of headlines could distort the truth and damage the nation. He began to rebel, not with a dramatic public exit, but with a quiet ideological schism that grew into a chasm. The younger William believed in a more responsible, internationalist approach to journalism, a direct challenge to his father's core beliefs. Their disagreements over how to cover World War II and the subsequent Cold War were not just professional disputes. They were a fundamental betrayal in the elder Hearst's eyes. The father, who had built an empire on controlling the narrative, found he could not control his own son's mind. William Randolph Jr., along with his brothers, eventually pushed to take the Hearst Corporation public, a move that stripped the patriarch of his absolute personal control. It was the ultimate act of defiance, using the tools of modern business to dismantle the very autocracy their father had created. The man who taught America to distrust everything it read had ultimately taught his own children to distrust him. The poison of the Hearst name did not just spark ideological battles in the boardroom. It exploded onto the national stage in a way that no one could have predicted, dragging the family into a nightmare of violence and public shame. The vehicle for this humiliation was not a son, but a granddaughter. Patricia Hearst, known to the world as Patty, was a 19-year-old college student, living a life of sheltered privilege far from the newspaper wars of her grandfather. That all ended on the night of February 4th, 1974, when she was violently kidnapped from her apartment by a radical left-wing group calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army. For the Hearst family, this was not just a personal tragedy. It was a direct assault on their entire legacy. The SLA did not want money. They wanted to humiliate the Hearst empire and use its heiress as a propaganda tool. They forced the family to set up a massive food distribution program for the poor, a move designed to publicly embarrass the conservative dynasty by making it appear to cave to radical demands. The family complied, spending millions, but the situation only grew more bizarre and damaging. The true betrayal in the eyes of the public, and likely her own family, came just 2 months later. Surveillance cameras captured Patty Hearst, now calling herself Tanya, wielding a submachine gun during a bank robbery alongside her captors. The heiress to a media fortune had seemingly become a revolutionary. For her grandfather's generation, this was the ultimate disgrace. The family that had built its power on controlling the news cycle was now the subject of a sordid, uncontrollable national drama. The Hearsts were plunged into a bitter internal conflict over how to respond. Some relatives saw Patty as a brainwashed victim who needed to be rescued and protected from the spotlight. Others, steeped in the family's tradition of fierce public image control, viewed her actions as an unforgivable stain on their name. They worried that any show of sympathy would be seen as weakness, or worse, an endorsement of her radical turn. The family's private shame became a public spectacle, played out in newspaper headlines and on television screens that the Hearst empire itself owned. When Patty was finally captured after a year on the run, the divisions only deepened. Her trial was a media circus, with the prosecution arguing she was a willing participant, a traitor to her class and country. The family had to decide whether to mount a vigorous defense that painted her as a victim of psychological torture, a narrative that would keep the embarrassing story in the news, or to distance themselves from the entire affair. The saga of Patty Hearst was more than a kidnapping. It was a profound family betrayal that forced the Hearsts to confront the dark side of the legacy they had so carefully constructed. The name that had once commanded the nation's attention was now synonymous with a national scandal, proving that no amount of wealth or influence could shield a dynasty from the consequences of its own notoriety. The Guggenheims seemed to be the one dynasty that got it right. Under the stern guidance of their patriarch mayor, the seven brothers formed a united front, a solid wall of familial loyalty that conquered the global mining and smelting industry. Mayer did not pit his sons against each other. He drilled into them a single, unwavering principle: the family comes first, always. For decades, this code held strong. The brothers, from the eldest Daniel to the youngest William, operated as a single entity, a council of kings managing their empire from a shared office in New York. They trusted each other implicitly, making monumental decisions about mines in Alaska and smelters in Colorado, with a collective resolve that their rivals could not fathom. This was not the Vanderbilt model of cutthroat competition. It was a testament to what a family could achieve when it truly worked as one. But absolute power, as it always does, eventually tests even the strongest bonds. The first cracks appeared not in the boardroom, but in the very philosophy of their enterprise. The older brothers, like Daniel and Murray, were their father's sons, cautious and pragmatic, believing in slow, steady expansion and reinvesting profits back into the core business of smelting. The younger brothers, particularly Simon and Solomon, were visionaries. They saw a new world of high finance and wanted to transform the Guggenheims from industrial titans into financial royalty, leveraging their fortune to invest in railroads, public utilities, and vast new ventures. This was more than a disagreement over strategy. It was a fundamental clash of identities. The older brothers viewed the younger ones as reckless gamblers, betraying the careful, brick-by-brick approach that had built their fortune. The younger brothers saw the elders as timid and outdated, standing in the way of progress and a grander legacy. The family council, once a chamber of harmony, became a battlefield of competing visions. The final irreparable break came over the American Smelting and Refining Company, a massive trust the Guggenheims created to dominate the industry. The infighting over its management and the direction of its profits became so toxic that the brothers could no longer bear to sit in the same room. The unthinkable happened. The council was dissolved. The seven brothers, the living embodiment of their father's dream of unity, formally split their assets and went their separate ways. They divided their global empire into personal fiefdoms, each brother taking control of his own slice of the fortune. The great Guggenheim solidarity, the one shining exception to the rule of familial betrayal, had shattered under the weight of its own success. The brothers who had been taught that family was everything discovered that when the fortune grew large enough, even everything could be divided. Daniel Guggenheim sat in the chairman's seat, but the throne of the American Smelting and Refining Company was cracking beneath him. He was the eldest brother, the one charged with upholding their father Mayor's sacred code of unity. But the very company that had been their greatest triumph, the Astor Trust, became the battlefield where that unity was sacrificed. Daniel believed in the family's industrial roots, in the steady, predictable profits of mining and smelting that had built their fortune. He saw expansion as a careful, calculated process. His younger brothers, Solomon and Simon, looked at the same balance sheets and saw limitations. They envisioned the Guggenheim fortune as a lever to move the world, investing in daring new technologies and sprawling infrastructure projects far beyond the soot and ore of the smelters. This was not a simple disagreement. It was a fundamental clash over the family's soul. The arguments within the family council grew so heated that the brothers could no longer speak civilly. Solomon, a patron of the arts with a grand vision for the family name, and Simon, the most financially ambitious of them all, formed a powerful bloc against Daniel's conservative leadership. They pushed for radical investments in Chilean copper mines and Alaskan railroads, ventures that Daniel considered dangerously speculative. He saw their ambition not as progress, but as a betrayal of their father's prudent, collective philosophy. The final, irrevocable break came when Solomon and Simon, frustrated by Daniel's veto power, began maneuvering to redirect Asarco massive profits into their own personal investment vehicles. For Daniel, this was the ultimate sin, a direct subversion of the family first principle. It was no longer a debate, it was a corporate coup. The conflict exploded out of the boardroom and into the courtroom, with legal filings that laid bare the bitter divisions between the Guggenheim brothers. The once impenetrable family trust was legally dismantled, their shared empire fractured into separate, rival fortunes. The brothers who had been taught that family was everything discovered that when the fortune grew large enough, even everything could be divided. And in the silence that followed the legal battles, a new question emerged. What becomes of a family's legacy when its last remaining bond is a shared name? The Guggenheim shattered council proved that even the strongest family bonds could be broken by the weight of a fortune. But another dynasty perfected a different kind of fracture, one hidden behind a facade of quiet dignity. While the Vanderbilts and Hearsts battled in the headlines, the Mellon family built an empire of unprecedented power in the shadows of Pittsburgh's smokestacks. Their patriarch, Thomas Mellon, was a judge who viewed life with the cold logic of a balance sheet. He instilled in his sons, particularly the brilliant and reserved Andrew W. Mellon, a profound belief in discretion. Their wealth, drawn from banking, aluminum, and oil, was accumulated so quietly it was almost invisible, a deliberate strategy to avoid the public spectacle that plagued their rivals. But this culture of silence did not prevent betrayal. It merely pushed the conflict behind the closed doors of their own mansions. Andrew W. Mellon became one of the richest and most powerful men in America, serving as Secretary of the Treasury for 3 presidents. He was the embodiment of his father's philosophy, a man who believed that wealth was a private matter to be preserved and expanded, not flaunted. This brought him into direct and painful conflict with his own son, Paul. Paul Mellon was not a financier. He was a poet at heart, drawn to art, literature, and the open countryside. He saw his father's vast fortune not as a tool for further accumulation, but as a means to support culture, education, and conservation. For Andrew, this was a profound rejection of everything he stood for. He viewed Paul's philanthropic interests as frivolous, a betrayal of the Mellon legacy of austere financial discipline. The tension between them was a cold war of ideologies, fought over dinner tables and in the wording of wills. Andrew could not comprehend a son who did not want to inherit his seat in the world of high finance. He systematically attempted to control Paul's life, dictating his education and trying to steer him toward the family business, all while expressing deep disappointment in his son's lack of ambition for banking. This emotional neglect was its own form of betrayal, a rejection of Paul's very identity. The conflict over the fortune's legacy became public when Andrew, in a final act of control, structured his estate in a way that limited Paul's ability to freely give the money away. He created trusts with restrictive clauses, designed to keep the capital intact and managed by bankers, not spent on what he considered sentimental causes. Paul Mellon spent a significant part of his life gracefully but determinedly untangling these legal constraints, using the fortune his father had guarded so fiercely to fund the National Gallery of Art and countless universities. In the end, the son betrayed his father's narrow vision by transforming the Mellon name from a symbol of secretive wealth into a beacon of public generosity, a quiet victory that echoed through museums and campuses for generations. The quiet dignity of the Mellon fortune proved to be its most fragile illusion. Andrew W. Mellon's meticulous plans for his legacy did not end with his son Paul, but cascaded down to his grandchildren, where the veneer of family unity finally shattered in a spectacular display of greed and accusation. The battle was not over a single company, but over the sprawling billion-dollar trusts he had created, trusts designed to perpetuate his name through philanthropy and art. At the center of the storm were his grandchildren, particularly Timothy Mellon and his cousin, Matthew Taylor Mellon. Their legal war was not a single case, but a protracted, multi-front conflict that dragged through the courts for decades, draining fortunes in legal fees and exposing a bitterness that money alone could not soothe. The disputes centered on control, not just of wealth, but of identity. Who truly represented the Mellon legacy? The family foundations, intended to be vehicles for charitable giving, became fortresses to be besieged. Family members filed lawsuits alleging mismanagement, self-dealing, and breaches of fiduciary duty, each legal filing reading like a public airing of private grievances. The art collection Andrew and Paul had so carefully assembled, meant to be a gift to the nation, became another pawn in their battles, with disputes over appraisals, ownership, and the very right to donate certain pieces. The most personal betrayals, however, emerged in the fights over personal trusts. Timothy Mellon, a deeply private man, found himself pitted against other relatives and their spouses in complex litigation over inheritance distributions. Accusations flew that some family members were attempting to manipulate trust structures to divert funds away from Andrew Mellon's original charitable intent and into their own pockets. The legal documents painted a picture of a family where trust had been completely replaced by lawyers and forensic accountants. For decades, the Mellon name had been synonymous with silent, dignified power, a world away from the public feuds of the Vanderbilts. But these inheritance wars proved that no dynasty was immune. When the final will of a patriarch becomes a labyrinth of legal constraints, it does not ensure harmony. It only provides a map for the war to come. And so we must ask, if a fortune large enough to endow museums and universities cannot buy family peace, what can it possibly be worth in the end? Even the most disciplined family council could not withstand the poison of a father's blatant favoritism. The Harriman Railroad Empire, a network of steel that stitched a continent together, was nearly torn apart by the very man who built it, E. H. Harriman. He was a financial genius who rescued the Union Pacific Railroad from ruin and forged it into a modern marvel. But he ruled his own home with a destructive partiality that his other children would never forgive. His clear and unwavering favorite was his eldest son, William Averill Harriman. From a young age, Averill was groomed as the sole heir apparent, given unparalleled access to his father's business dealings, and instilled with a sense of destiny that his siblings were denied. E.H. took Averill on inspection tours of the rail lines, discussed high finance with him as if he were a partner, and meticulously prepared him to take the reins. This was not subtle preference. It was a coronation in progress, and it left his other son, Edward Roland Noel Harriman, known as Roland, in a perpetual shadow. Roland watched as his father poured all his attention, his wisdom, and his hopes into Averill. He received none of the same mentorship, none of the same whispered confidence, none of the same belief in his capabilities. The message was searingly clear in the Harriman dynasty. There was room for only one prince. When E. H. Harriman died in 1909, his will codified this lifelong betrayal. He left the overwhelming bulk of his controlling interest in the Union Pacific, the crown jewel of his empire, directly to Averill. Roland and his sister received generous trust funds, a fortune by any normal standard, but they were deliberately excluded from the real prize, power. They were shareholders, not stewards. They had wealth, but no voice in the empire that bore their name. This deliberate imbalance ignited a bitterness in Roland that would fuel a decades-long Cold War. He was not content to be a passive recipient of his brother's rule. He used his own substantial inheritance to become a powerful force in banking, building his own rival financial institution. The brothers maintained a public facade of civility, but behind the scenes, they were locked in a relentless struggle for influence over the family's sprawling interests. Every board meeting, every strategic decision about the railroads became a subtle battleground. Roland challenged Averill's authority at every turn, questioning his leadership and forming alliances with other directors to counter his brother's control. The fraternal bond had been sacrificed on the altar of their father's favoritism, replaced by a quiet, simmering conflict that ensured the Harriman fortune, like so many others, would be forever shadowed by a brother's resentment. A wife's signature was often just a formality, a silent consent on a document she was never meant to understand. For the women married into these industrial dynasties, the ultimate betrayal was not a dramatic courtroom drama, but a quiet, legal one embedded in the trusts and wills that governed their lives. These financial instruments, designed by husbands and fathers to protect the fortune, systematically stripped wives and daughters of their autonomy, leaving them with immense social status, but the financial independence of a child. They lived in palaces, but they could not write a check for its upkeep without a trustee's permission. Their names were in the society pages, but not on the deeds to their own homes. This was a disenfranchisement dressed in silk and diamonds, a betrayal that used the law itself as its weapon. Consider the story of Lela Emery. She was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist, and when she married John J. Emery, a prominent Cincinnati real estate magnate, it should have been a union of equals. But the fortune she brought into the marriage was immediately locked away in a trust controlled by her husband and his male advisors. For years, Lela lived a life of gilded dependency, her every expenditure monitored and approved by the very men who were supposed to be her partners. When the marriage soured and she sought a divorce, the true nature of her cage was revealed. The trust, which contained her own inheritance, was used as a tool against her. Her husband and his trustees fought her relentlessly in court, arguing that she was unfit to manage her own money. Lela was forced to wage a brutal legal war against her own family, not for a greater share of the wealth, but for the basic right to control the fortune that was rightfully hers. Her battle exposed the cruel irony of the system. A woman had to prove her competence to a court of men simply to access what was already hers by birth. She was not alone. Countless heiresses found themselves in similar gilded traps. They were given allowances, sometimes staggeringly large ones, but the capital, the real source of power, was kept forever out of their reach. A father's will might provide a generous income for a daughter, but it would also stipulate that the principal must pass to her male children, or worse, to a brother or uncle who was deemed more financially astute. The legal system of the time, reflecting the patriarchal values of the era, often sided with the male trustees, viewing women as inherently incapable of managing complex finances. This created a permanent state of financial childhood, a profound powerlessness that poisoned marriages and fueled silent resentments. These women were the human collateral in the dynastic plans of men who believed that bloodlines were less important than balance sheets. So we must ask, what kind of legacy is built when the very people who carry your name are legally prevented from carrying their own weight? The echoes of these gilded betrayals have never truly faded. From the Vanderbilts to the Hearsts, a single corrosive pattern emerges. Unchecked ambition and the relentless pursuit of wealth systematically corrupted the most fundamental human bonds, turning fathers against sons and siblings into lifelong adversaries. These families amassed fortunes that could buy entire cities, yet they could not purchase the one thing that truly endures: familial trust. The poison was not in the money itself, but in the absolute power it represented and the fear of losing it. This legacy of suspicion and control became the only inheritance that consistently trickled down through the generations. And if these stories feel hauntingly familiar, it is because the same dynamics play out today in the boardrooms and courtrooms of modern billionaire dynasties. The names have changed, but the battles over trusts, corporate control, and public image continue with a striking resonance. The age-old question remains: can any amount of wealth ever be worth the cost of your own family? After this journey through the deepest betrayals of the Gilded Age, we want to hear from you. Which of these family feuds shocked you the most? Was it the Vanderbilt War of the Wills, the cold estrangement of the Mellons, or the very public downfall of the Hearsts? Share your thoughts in the comments below.